Have you ever noticed that no matter how far science advances, we still don't truly know what it means to be conscious? We know how neurons fire, how the brain reacts, but no one can explain the exact point where the experience of existing takes place. Consciousness cannot be measured, and perhaps that's why it remains the greatest mystery of both physics and the mind. Some physicists believe it doesn't arise from the brain, but from something more fundamental, a quantum field of information that connects everything. It is in this realm that reason meets the limits of what can be proven, and the human being becomes the very laboratory of the unknown. Modern physics has learned to deal with everything that can be counted, predicted, and repeated. It is the realm of precision, particles, waves, forces, fields, energies. Everything must have a number, a unit of measurement, a result that can be reproduced in any laboratory in the world. This is the pact that sustains science, that only what can be proven is real. But there is one point that this pact has never been able to reach, that of internal experience. Consciousness does not obey the rules of repetition. It changes depending on who observes, the emotional state, the moment, the context. It is not a physical variable. It is a presence. The problem is that this presence interferes with reality itself. The famous double-slit experiment, for example, showed that a particle behaves differently when it is being observed. That shook the foundations of classical physics because it implied that the act of observing changes what is observed. For decades, scientists tried to explain this phenomenon in technical terms, avoiding any mention of consciousness. But the question remained, what exactly is the observer? A measuring device, or something more? Science avoids speaking of consciousness as a cause because it cannot be isolated in a test tube. But that is precisely what makes it the most uncomfortable point in all of scientific investigation. Everything that can be studied begins with perception. Before an experiment exists, there is someone perceiving it. Before the equation, there is thought. Before the data, there is a consciousness interpreting it. And no matter how much physics tries to exclude the observer from its formulas, the observer is always there, silent, altering the game from the beginning. When scientists look into the brain for the origin of consciousness, they find only correlations, not causes. Electrical waves, synapses, chemical variations, all of that happens, but none explain the I that perceives what is happening. It's like studying the wires of a lamp to understand the nature of light. You can dismantle every component and measure every circuit, but the brightness that emerges when the lamp is turned on isn't in any isolated part of the system. It arises from interaction, from the field that forms when everything connects. Modern physics runs into the same kind of limit. It was built upon the idea of separation between subject and object, observer and phenomenon, mind and matter. That division worked for centuries and allowed for extraordinary progress. But when we reach the quantum level, the boundaries begin to dissolve. The electron has no defined position until it is observed. Reality is not fixed, but probabilistic. And the very idea of a world out there independent of the consciousness observing it becomes uncertain. That uncertainty is what traditional physics tries to neutralize. It seeks universal and predictable laws, while the quantum field seems to respond with something alive, dynamic, changeable. The scientist measures the particle, but the particle seems to measure the scientist as well. There is a kind of silent dialogue between the observer and the observed, as if both were part of the same process. This breaks the paradigm of control, and that's where the discomfort begins. Science was born to eliminate mystery, but perhaps the role of quantum physics is the opposite, to reveal that mystery is a structural part of reality. The blind spot of modern physics is the belief that everything can be translated into numbers. But human experience shows the opposite. The greatest truths do not fit into measurements. Love, intuition, presence, consciousness, they are real phenomena, though immeasurable. There are no instruments to quantify what we feel when we realize we exist. Some scientists are beginning to admit that consciousness may not be a product of the universe, but its very foundation. This idea is still met with resistance because it shifts the basis of physics into an almost philosophical territory. Yet it is undeniable that something escapes the equations. Quantum reality seems to require a new kind of observer. not a neutral technician before a phenomenon, but a presence that participates in the very event itself. The blind spot of modern physics is not a flaw in science, but an invitation to expand its field of perception. Perhaps it's not about abandoning the scientific method, but recognizing that it has boundaries. What lies beyond them is not irrational, just not yet measurable. When consciousness enters the scene, the known laws tremble, because something within the observer alters the very nature of the experiment. Physics may continue to seek answers in the behavior of particles, but as long as it ignores the field of consciousness, it will always encounter paradoxes. The human mind is not merely an external observer, it is an integral part of the universe it tries to understand. And it is in this blind spot, where feeling replaces measuring, that a new science begins to emerge, one not of objects, but of presence. For centuries, it was believed that understanding the brain would be enough to decipher the mystery of consciousness. Neuroscience has advanced like never before, mapping regions, identifying electrical patterns, and reconstructing thoughts in digital images. But no matter how detailed those maps are, they do not show who is observing the map. The brain is a complex physical structure, but consciousness does not behave like an ordinary biological function. It cannot be located or reduced to a sum of electrical impulses. When someone feels, thinks, or becomes self-aware, something happens that transcends the domain of matter. Science can detect when an emotion occurs, but not what it is from the inside. No instrument reveals what it means for a specific person to remember childhood, to feel fear, to love, or to realize they are observing their own thoughts. These phenomena are subjective, but not unreal. They are the essence of human experience, and it is precisely here that the materialist model of the mind begins to crumble. Consciousness does not appear as a byproduct of the brain. It seems to be the field that makes the brain functional. When we observe brain activity, we see circuits light up like illuminated cities. But who is seeing this? Who is aware of seeing? This I that observes is not found in any of those connections. There is no point in the brain that contains the experience of being. What exists are correlations, activities that accompany consciousness, but do not produce it. Just as a computer screen displays images, but is not the source of the data generating them, the brain may simply be the medium through which consciousness expresses itself, not its origin. Some studies have tried to locate the center of consciousness in the prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, or specific neural networks. But all run into the same obstacle. When observed closely, the phenomenon dissolves. The brain reacts, but does not initiate the act of perceiving. It translates impulses, but does not create them. This absence of an origin point raises a hypothesis that science resists admitting that consciousness does not emerge from the brain, but that the brain emerges within consciousness. This inversion is unsettling because it subverts the entire scientific structure. It suggests that the physical universe is not the stage where consciousness operates, but rather a manifestation within it. The brain, in this context, would be a tuning instrument, an interface that translates the conscious field into material perceptions. Just as a radio captures invisible frequencies and turns them into sound, the brain translates information from the field of consciousness into mental experiences. But the field itself does not depend on the device. Near-death experiences, deep meditative states, and accounts of lucidity in comas challenge the materialist paradigm. People whose brains were inactive for minutes report lucid perception, coherent memory, and a sense of unity that transcends the body. Science tries to explain this as residual activity or hallucination, but the question remains: how can there be perception without brain function? What is perceiving when the brain shuts down? What neuroscience calls consciousness is, in fact, the interface between the inner and outer worlds. But the original phenomenon, the pure act of perceiving, remains unexplained. It has no weight, color, or shape, and yet it is the only thing we can never doubt. Everything can be questioned: the world, the senses, memories, except the fact that we are conscious. This direct and silent certainty makes consciousness the central enigma of all existence. Even the most sophisticated experiments reveal a fundamental limitation. It is impossible to observe consciousness from the outside. The scientist attempting to study it is using the very phenomenon they are trying to measure. It's like trying to measure light with an instrument made of light. This circularity creates a paradox that no technology can break. Consciousness is both the subject and the object of investigation. It is the field in which knowledge arises, and therefore can never be fully contained within it. Modern science still tries to fit this issue into its vocabulary. It speaks of information processing, emergent complexity, and self-organization. But these concepts only move the mystery elsewhere. They do not solve it. To say that consciousness results from billions of neural connections is like claiming that a symphony is merely the mechanical vibration of instruments. Something escapes, meaning unity, presence. The brain is the hardware. Consciousness is the invisible operating system that makes it work. Without this field of perception, there is no reality to interpret. Every sensation, every thought, every emotion exists because there is a silent observer recognizing them. It is this recognition that physics and biology still cannot explain. Consciousness remains outside their graphs and tables because it is not a phenomenon that happens in time. It is the very time in which everything happens. The challenge for science may not be to find consciousness, but to accept that it has always been looking through its instruments. The brain is only the mirror in which the mystery reflects itself, but the reflection is not the source of the light. As long as we search for the origin of consciousness within matter, the answer will continue to escape, because what observes is not made of what is observed. And it is in this difference, invisible yet undeniable, that the phenomenon of consciousness remains beyond the reach of scientific explanation. Quantum physics revealed something no scientist expected. Reality is not a fixed stage where events unfold indifferent to whoever observes them. At the most fundamental level of matter, the simple act of observing changes the outcome. This principle, known as the observer effect, is not a metaphor but a fact measured in the laboratory. The behavior of particles changes as they are observed. Before measurement, they exist as possibilities, probability waves spread in all directions. The instant someone observes, the field of possibilities collapses and a specific reality manifests. This means the presence of the observer is an integral part of the phenomenon. Classical physics, accustomed to separating subject and object, doesn't know what to do with this finding. The observer is not just the one who records the result, but the one who participates in its formation. This idea is uncomfortable because it dismantles the ideal of objectivity that supported science for centuries. But the discomfort grows when one realizes that this principle is not restricted to laboratories. It seems to operate at every moment of human life. Consciousness, by observing, influences what it observes. This is visible in experiments, but also in personal experiences. A thought changes the perception of an environment. An expectation alters the way we see a person. An emotional state changes how we interpret facts. Reality responds to the quality of the presence that perceives it. This does not mean that the physical world depends on individual will, but that there is an interdependence between the observer's internal state and the behavior of what is observed. What quantum mechanics describes mathematically, human experience feels directly. When we are attentive, the environment seems to reorganize. When we are distracted, the world becomes opaque, indistinct. Consciousness illuminates what it touches, and perhaps this is the everyday manifestation of the same quantum principle that acts on particles. Conscious presence is the factor that defines what is real. In experiments with photons, electrons, and even complex molecules, the interference pattern changes when there is an observer. This doesn't happen by magic, but because the act of measuring requires interaction. To observe, energy must be exchanged, and this exchange alters the system. On the human scale, the interaction is more subtle, but follows the same logic. The way we look at the world interferes with it. Attention is a form of energy, and each focus of consciousness changes the structure of experience. Imagine a scientist in front of a detector. He expects to find a particle, but before it manifests, all that exists is probability. It is his gaze, the act of measuring, that makes the universe choose a result. Now imagine the same principle applied to everyday life. The situations we live through are also fields of possibility. The way we observe them, The attention we give, the kind of presence we offer, shape what emerges as reality. Physics can explain the phenomenon with equations, but its human meaning is deeper. The quantum observer is not just a scientist measuring particles, it is every person participating in the fabric of existence. Reality seems to be relational, not static. It is as if the universe were in constant dialogue with the consciousness that observes it, responding not to words but to the quality of presence. When we look at the world as something separate, we see fragments. When we look as part of it, we see patterns. The consciousness that observes with openness creates coherence. The one that observes with fear or resistance generates noise. This is reflected at every scale, from physics to human relationships. Presence changes the field. The way we observe the other changes the way the other manifests. The way we look at life changes the life we see. Some physicists try to eliminate the observer from the equations, calling it a philosophical problem. But perhaps it is not a problem. Perhaps it is the starting point. The universe does not behave like a machine, but like an interactive process. It does not happen on its own. It happens in relation. The observer does not create reality out of nothing, but acts as a catalyst for a potential. Thus, consciousness is not a passive spectator, but part of the fundamental structure that makes the real possible. The implication is radical. If consciousness influences the world, then understanding one's own mind becomes a physical act, not just a psychological one. Every thought is a form of observation, and every observation reorganizes the field around it. The quantum observer is the invisible link between the visible and the invisible, between what is measurable and what is lived. Physics, with all its precision, runs up against this point and must admit, presence is a component of reality. Consciousness not only perceives the universe, it summons it to exist in a specific form. Calculation can predict probabilities, but it is attention that determines which of them will become real. In this sense, the observer is not an intruder, but the very dynamic center where the universe recognizes itself. The mystery is not how particles behave, but why the human gaze seems to have the power to decide which of them manifests. This is the frontier where physics becomes philosophy, and measurement becomes experience. Deep down, the universe seems to respond less to calculation and more to presence, as if reality waited to be seen to know what it is. The history of science has always been driven by uncomfortable questions, but there are certain questions that scientists themselves prefer not to ask. Not because instruments or resources are lacking, but because the possible answers shake the foundations of the method that gives them security. Around quantum consciousness, there is a territory of silent, almost taboo research. These are experiments that suggest the observer is not just a neutral recorder, but an active participant in the fabric of reality. And if that is true, the line between the objective and the subjective ceases to exist. The double-slit experiment is the best known among these paradoxes. When electrons are fired through a double slit without observation, they behave like waves and create interference patterns. But when there is an instrument recording the path, the waves collapse into particles, as if they knew they were being watched. No scientist can explain why the simple presence of an observer changes the behavior of matter. This finding, although repeatedly confirmed, is treated with caution. Because admitting that consciousness interferes with the result is to admit that it has a causal role in the structure of the universe. In the 1990s, some physicists tried to move in this direction. The Pier experiment at Princeton University became one of the most controversial. It involved random number generators and volunteers instructed to influence the results using only the mind. After thousands of trials, the statistical averages showed consistent, though subtle, deviations. Small but beyond what chance would allow. The scientific community reacted with silence or irony, not because the data were fraudulent, but because there was no theoretical model capable of integrating them without breaking the paradigm of separation between mind and matter. Other experiments, such as those on quantum entanglement, intensified the discomfort. Two particles that interact remain connected even when separated by great distances. Measuring one instantly changes the state of the other. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, an expression that revealed discomfort more than explanation. Decades later, more precise tests confirmed that the phenomenon is real. But what remains out of reach is the mechanism that makes it possible. How can two particles exchange information without physical mediation in zero time? Space seems to bend before the presence of the consciousness that observes the event. The scientific field tries to contain these paradoxes within safe limits. One speaks of non-locality, superposition, and wave function collapse. These are attempts to translate the mystery into technical language, but the problem persists. The act of measuring changes what is measured. Consciousness, when interacting, leaves a mark. And if it leaves a mark, then it is not just a witness, but an agent. This conclusion threatens the heart of modern empiricism. Because if the observer is part of the phenomenon, there are no purely objective experiments anymore. Every measurement becomes a dialogue between the world and the mind that observes it. Some scientists argue that these effects only manifest at subatomic scales, with no relevance to the macroscopic world, but this justification no longer convinces. Various observations show that biological systems also exhibit quantum coherence. Photosynthesis, smell, and even the functioning of certain neurons seem to depend on quantum processes. If this is confirmed, what is treated today as a laboratory curiosity may be the structural principle of life and consciousness. The boundary between physics and biology dissolves. The experiments that challenge the dominant model are not only physical, they are philosophical. They force science to face its own limit. It is as if the universe were saying, up to here you can calculate. Beyond that you must be present. This presence cannot be quantified, but it has a measurable effect. When the observer changes, the phenomenon changes. This is the finding many avoid because it requires a new kind of science. A science that includes subjectivity without losing rigor. Some independent laboratories are trying to revisit this frontier with new methodologies. They propose protocols in which the researcher's state of consciousness is part of the experimental variable. Cardiac coherence, breathing pattern, focus of attention, all of this is monitored along with the physical experiment. Preliminary results suggest correlations. When the observer maintains a stable state of presence, random fluctuations decrease. When they are scattered or emotionally reactive, the system loses coherence. This does not prove a direct causality, but points to an interaction that traditional physics does not yet know how to name. These studies face resistance because they dismantle the idea of neutrality. If consciousness influences the result, then the researcher is never just a recorder of facts. He is part of the phenomenon he investigates. This finding redefines what it means to observe, and perhaps that is why so many prefer to ignore the subject, not out of lack of curiosity, but for self-preservation of the method itself. Science is a language of order. It needs clear boundaries to function. But the universe, by all indications, does not fully obey these boundaries. It responds to observation with creativity, as if matter itself possessed a kind of sensitivity. Every time an experiment threatens to reveal this, the discomfort returns. Not out of fear of error, but out of fear of being right. The experiments that science avoids are those that would force it to reinvent itself. They do not contradict known laws. They merely show that those laws are not the end of the story. There is a broader field where consciousness and matter meet before they become separate concepts. This field does not fit into equations, but perhaps it is the place where all of them originate. And it is there at that boundary between what is measured and what is lived that science rediscovers the mystery that gave it birth. Before any particle existed, before there was time, space, or laws, something was already present, the possibility of perceiving. This is the boldest hypothesis that quantum physics and the philosophy of mind are beginning to touch, albeit hesitantly. What if consciousness were not a byproduct of evolution, but the original field from which everything else manifests? This idea is neither mystical nor theological. It is a logical inference in the face of what physics itself reveals when it tries to reach the zero point of reality. The visible universe is an ocean of information. Everything vibrates, oscillates, and relates in patterns of energy. But what sustains these patterns? What maintains coherence between particles that are separated by billions of kilometers and yet act as if they were aware of one another? The most coherent hypothesis is that there is a unified, non-physical field that contains and connects all manifestations. And this field, for many contemporary scientists, has the properties of consciousness. It is self-organizing, relational, and non-local. Quantum physics describes this field as an infinite network of probabilities. Each particle, before being observed, is only a possibility. The act of observation, conscious attention, is what makes it emerge in concrete form. Thus, the physical universe would be a kind of precipitation of consciousness. Matter, in this sense, would be the shadow of the mind upon space-time. The visible would be only the reflection of the invisible. This idea seems poetic, but it arises from evidence. The deeper science investigates, the fewer things it finds and the more relationships. The atom is not a solid little ball, but a dance of energy. The space between particles is almost total. The solidity we feel is only the resistance of fields touching each other. This means that reality is, in essence, a pattern of information vibrating within something greater, and that something greater may be consciousness itself. If consciousness is the fundamental field, the universe is not a machine but an organism. It does not merely exist, it recognizes itself. Every form of life would be a window through which the field perceives itself. The human being, with self-awareness, would be one of the most complex forms of this perception, but not the only one. Consciousness would be in everything, in particles, in plants, in stars, in the atoms of one's own body. Not as thought but as presence, a silent knowing of existing. When we look at the world from this perspective, the meaning of existence changes. The separation between subject and object dissolves. The universe is not something external, but an extension of the same field that composes us. Our perception of the world is not a passive representation, it is an active creation. We are co-authors of the real. The boundary between mind and matter is only a linguistic convention. At every moment, consciousness shapes form and form feeds consciousness, a continuous cycle of creation and recognition. This view also reconfigures the role of time. If consciousness precedes the universe, it is not subject to time. Time is within it. Past and future are variations of the same field that observes itself from different angles. The now is the point where all probabilities converge. And when someone becomes fully present, something of the original field manifests. The sense that the I and the universe are expressions of the same principle. Modern science is beginning to glimpse this scenario, even if it does not openly admit it. People speak of a quantum information field, dynamic vacuum, or unified energy field, technical terms to describe what, in plainer language, we call consciousness. It is the same field that gives rise to the laws of physics, but cannot be explained by them. Mathematical logic itself rests on a backdrop it cannot measure, the act of perceiving. This hypothesis does not diminish science, it expands it. It shows that the observer is not outside the universe, but is the universe itself looking at itself. This shift changes everything, the way we understand life, death, mind, and the cosmos. If consciousness is the basis of everything, then nothing is truly separate. Everything that exists is an expression of the same field perceiving itself in different ways, and that includes every thought, every emotion, every atom. When someone becomes aware that consciousness itself is part of the fabric of the universe, everyday life takes on another dimension. Decisions cease to be merely mental choices and become movements of the field itself reorganizing. The gaze, the breath, the silence, everything becomes a participant in the cosmic process. Consciousness ceases to be a personal property and becomes the space where the universe happens. Perhaps this is the point at which science needs to relearn how to ask. Instead of what is consciousness, perhaps the question is, why does everything seem to behave as if it were conscious? The universe acts like a system that recognizes itself, and physics, in trying to describe it, ends up describing itself. The boundary between observer and observed disappears. The cosmos and the mind become aspects of the same movement, becoming conscious of being. If consciousness is the fabric that precedes the physical universe, then life is not an accident, but an inevitable expression of this field. We are the universe becoming sensitive to itself. With each perception, it expands a little more, and if you have made it this far, perhaps you are already feeling it, the presence that observes the thought about the very act of observing. This is the direct experience of the conscious field. If this resonated with you, like this video and write in the comments, I am part of the field that perceives. Thus, each shared word becomes one more point of consciousness, awakening within the very universe that observes us. Consciousness can be studied from every angle, philosophical, neurological, quantum. But no approach reaches the heart of the matter. Where does the I that observes all this come from? That silent presence that accompanies every experience, that perceives thought, that notices the body, that recognizes time. Science can trace mental processes, map emotions, and even predict decisions seconds before they happen. But the essential point remains untouched. Who is it that is perceiving all of this happening? It is a simple question, and at the same time, the most subversive ever asked. Because if there is something in us that observes the brain itself, then the brain cannot be the observer. There is a prior immaterial layer that physics does not yet know how to name. This I is not the body, nor the mind, nor the memories. It is the field where all of this manifests. The mystery is not how consciousness arises from matter, but how matter appears within consciousness. Neuroscientists try to reduce identity to electrical and chemical patterns, but these patterns are only external representations of something that is lived from within. There is no equation that translates the flavor of a memory, the weight of a loss, or the instant when someone recognizes themselves as conscious. These are real phenomena, but inaccessible to measurement. And yet they are what give meaning to existence. Science can measure what happens, but not what it means to happen. This I that observes the universe is not an isolated entity. It is the very act of observing. It has no form, but without it, nothing can be known. It is the only constant amid change. Everything else transforms, the body, time, beliefs, relationships, but the fact of being conscious remains. That is why so many ancient spiritual traditions claim that the true I is neither born nor dies. And interestingly, quantum physics begins to suggest something similar when it recognizes that consciousness is not affected by the collapse of matter. If reality depends on observation, then the observer is more fundamental than the observed. Matter appears and disappears according to the gaze that contemplates it, but the gaze itself does not disappear. It is not produced by the brain. The brain is only one of its expressions. Physics can study the effects of this presence, but not its origin. And perhaps this is the greatest limitation of any science. It cannot step outside the field of consciousness to study it from the outside. The origin of the I cannot be located because it is not in space. It is the space where everything appears. When you observe a thought, there is something in you that is not the thought. When you feel an emotion, there is something that perceives it without being carried away by it. That something has no form or name, but it is the basis of all experience. It is like the silent background of a painting where all colors and shapes gain meaning. Without that background, there is no image. The paradox is that the I that seeks to understand the universe is the same that gives existence to the universe it tries to understand. Consciousness is simultaneously the point of origin and the point of observation. It creates the stage and the audience at the same time. When physics seeks the first cause, it comes upon this infinite mirror, because in the end, all it finds is the very act of perceiving. Physicists call the moment when a possibility becomes reality the collapse of the wave function. But this collapse only happens when there is observation. Who or what is observing? That is the central enigma. The answer cannot be a machine, nor a mathematical function, nor a nervous system. The observer seems to precede all these elements. It is the silent backdrop where the universe manifests and recognizes itself. Some say that the I is an illusion created by the brain to give continuity to experience. But even the idea of illusion requires an observer to perceive it. If everything were only a neural construction, who would be aware of that construction? The very notion of mind presupposes consciousness. And consciousness, as far as we know, has no material origin. It is the field where the concept of matter becomes possible. This is the frontier science avoids crossing. recognizing that the I may not have arisen within the universe, but that the universe arose within this I. Conscious presence would not be a side effect of creation. It would be creation itself in its purest form, the act of perceiving. The universe would then be an expanding experience within the consciousness that observes it, a continuous process of cosmic self-discovery. The question of the origin of the I may never have an answer, because the I is the answer itself. It is what remains when all theories, beliefs, and forms dissolve. The observer is the unmoving point amid movement, the silent center of all perceptions. And when this is perceived, not as a concept, but as a direct experience, the mystery ceases to be something to solve and becomes something to live. In the end, what science cannot explain is not the origin of the universe, but the origin of the one who is observing it. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all. The universe is not being seen by you. It is being seen as you. The I that observes the cosmos is the cosmos itself becoming conscious of itself. When two particles interact, even for an instant, something connects them in a way that surpasses any distance. This is the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, an invisible link that causes the state of one to instantly affect the state of the other, regardless of how many light years separate them. No physical signal travels between them, no classical force explains what occurs, but the correlation exists, it is measurable, repeated in countless experiments. The universe, at its core, seems not to know separation. This discovery, which began as a theoretical paradox, became one of the pillars of modern physics. But its reach goes beyond the laboratory. Entanglement is not just a phenomenon between particles, it is a living metaphor for reality itself. It suggests that the structure of the universe is relational, that nothing exists in isolation. Everything that is because it is in relation with everything else. Matter, energy, consciousness, all seem to be different expressions of the same network of interconnection. On the subatomic scale, entanglement is instantaneous. On the human scale, it manifests as synchronicity, empathy, intuition, subtle phenomena that defy linear explanations. When someone thinks of a person, and that person calls at the same moment, or when two distant individuals feel something similar at the same time, it is not necessarily coincidence. Perhaps it is an echo of the same principle, a non-local communication that operates at a level deeper than space and time. Physics calls this aspect of entanglement non-locality. Consciousness, in turn, experiences it as unity. It is as if the cosmos were a vast organism, where each part contains the whole and the whole manifests in each part. What happens at one point reverberates in all others. The idea of an individual begins to dissolve in the face of this perception. We are cells of the same universal body, temporary expressions of a shared intelligence. The human mind, conditioned by the feeling of separation, tries to interpret the world in terms of cause and effect. But entanglement challenges this logic. It does not obey the linear sequence of events. It reveals a field of simultaneity, where everything is connected in an absolute present. In this field, past and future are only different ways of observing the same phenomenon. Consciousness, upon recognizing this, ceases to be an island and becomes a meeting point between dimensions. The unity between mind and matter may not be a metaphor, but a real structure of the universe. The brain, made of entangled particles, cannot be disconnected from the larger field to which it belongs. Thought, emotion, perception all arise from interactions that are not limited to the physical body. What we call inner life may be just the subjective side of the same entanglement that unites everything that exists. If every particle in the body is linked to other particles scattered across the cosmos, then what we call the self is a temporary form of expression of this whole. The boundary between what is inside and what is outside loses meaning. Each breath is an exchange with the universe. Each perception is a conversation with the field that surrounds us. The mind does not observe the world from the outside. It is an interface of the world with itself. Entanglement shows that reality is more like a living web than a machine, and if consciousness is the thread running through this web, then every act of attention creates resonance. Conscious presence reorganizes the field, just as the state of one particle reorganizes that of another. Thinking, feeling, or acting are not isolated events. They are movements within a network of universal correlation. Physics tries to understand entanglement in terms of quantum information, but perhaps what is at stake is more than data. It is meaning. Each particle seems to know something that is nowhere, because place itself is only a convention within an indivisible field. Likewise, the mind knows things it did not learn, perceives connections that were not taught. Intuition may be the name we give to the human experience of entanglement. When one understands that mind and matter are expressions of the same principle, the very idea of separation dissolves. The duality between inner and outer, between observer and observed, proves to be a useful but incomplete illusion. What exists is a single process of self-knowledge happening at different scales. The universe observes itself through us, and we exist so that it can recognize itself. This view does not eliminate science. On the contrary, it broadens its scope. It shows that knowledge is not merely accumulating data, but perceiving patterns of connection. Every scientific discovery is deep down a reminder that we were never separate from what we study. When a physicist observes a particle, the field that unites them is observing itself. When someone perceives the link between a thought and an external event, the universe is signaling its coherence. Quantum entanglement is the mirror where unity reveals itself. It shows that reality is woven by invisible relations and that consciousness is the most direct expression of this network. There is no mind without matter, nor matter without mind. Both are faces of the same field that recognizes itself in infinite forms. Life, in this sense, is the constant movement of this recognition, the entire universe remembering that it is one. The microscope reaches the atom, the telescope touches the limits of the cosmos, but no instrument penetrates the simple fact of being conscious. No lens reveals the instant when someone perceives their own thought or recognizes that they exist. This boundary marks the point where science, however advanced, encounters something that cannot be measured, the experience of being. The human mind can dissect the universe with almost divine precision. Even so, the mystery of consciousness remains intact. What we feel when perceiving the world does not fit into numbers or equations. Biology explains the functioning of the brain, but not the meaning of thought. Physics describes the movement of particles, but not the presence that observes them. And it is in this gap, between knowing and perceiving, that inner experience begins. Science works with what is repeatable, but consciousness is unique at each instant. No inner experience happens twice in the same way. Each perception is unprecedented because the observer is never the same. That is why deep truth does not fit into external proofs. The recognition of being alive does not depend on demonstration. It imposes itself as silent evidence. The inner field works in the opposite way to the scientific method. In the laboratory, the researcher distances himself from the object. Within, the observer becomes the phenomenon itself. This kind of investigation does not seek results, but presence. When the effort to understand ceases, something more lucid is revealed, a clarity that does not come from reasoning, but from simple perception. This clarity needs no concepts. It arises as a feeling of immediate evidence. I am. No instrument records this instant, and yet it is the starting point of every form of knowledge. Without this foundation, no theory could even be formulated. Consciousness is the invisible ground upon which thought rises. Many scientists reach this limit and realize that the mystery is not in the laws of nature, but in the fact of being able to understand them. Einstein, Schrödinger, and Bohr touched this point by recognizing that reality is not only something to be described, but something that manifests through the mind that observes it. The very capacity to think is already an anomaly in the physical universe. Consciousness is the phenomenon that gives meaning to the existence of all others. Inner experience reveals this truth directly. When thought ceases for an instant and attention rests, a silent presence arises that needs no definition. This space of lucidity is the same in all beings regardless of culture, time, or belief. It does not belong to the brain or to personal history. It is prior to everything that can be named. Science can observe the neural activity that accompanies meditation, sleep, or emotion. But what occurs within the experience, pure feeling, knowing without words, remains out of reach. No graph shows the moment when someone feels at one with the world. No data translates the sensation of existing in peace. These are states measurable only by the consciousness that lives them. The inner universe follows its own laws. Time slows down, space seems to expand, and perception ceases to be limited to the body. The separation between inside and outside dissolves. Physics calls this non-locality. Consciousness calls it presence. In this state, what is perceived and what perceives become one and the same. The observer and the observed cease to be opposites and merge into the same field. Inner experience does not contradict science. It completes it. Physics reveals the structure of external reality, and consciousness reveals the structure of internal reality. Two faces of the same whole. Science offers explanations. Consciousness offers meaning. One describes the world, the other lives it. True understanding arises only when these two ways of seeing recognize each other. The point that science cannot cross is precisely what sustains the entire search. The fact that something in us knows it is alive. This perception needs no proof because it precedes the need to prove. The simple act of perceiving already contains all the evidence that something exists. Consciousness is the silent foundation upon which every experience, every discovery, every measurement rests. Inner experience reveals what science still cannot demonstrate. Reality is not only out there, but within the one who perceives it. Observation is a mirror, and the universe recognizes itself in every gaze that contemplates it. What cannot be proven, but can be felt, is the constant presence of the field that observes everything. The mystery is not distant. It is looking through the eyes that seek it. Quantum consciousness does not ask for answers, only presence. Science goes as far as calculation reaches, but it is in the observer's silence that the universe reveals itself. The mystery is not in what remains to be discovered, but in what is already being lived at this instant, the fact of existing and knowing that one exists. Each gaze is the cosmos itself recognizing itself. And if you felt this presence while listening, write in the comments, "I perceive what perceives me," so we know you made it to the end. Take the opportunity to subscribe and continue exploring with me the places where science touches the invisible.